Okay, our last video that I'm doing in this series anyways. Let's start with the meaning of numbers. This one's pretty easy conceptually. It's just that numbers in the Bible have more than just their numerical value in the text generally. So if a passage is using a number, and especially in symbolic or prophetic passages, you can look for a secondary meaning. And again, the secondary meaning isn't to replace the use of the number in the plain understanding of the text. It gives additional meaning to what's going on. So for instance, Moses went up the mountain for 40 days to receive the tablets from God and to commune with God. And what happened down below, there was the Jewish people, after a few days, decided, well, maybe Moses isn't coming back, and they fashioned a bull idol made out of gold, and they worshipped it, and they started doing all their pagan practices and whatever. And the 40 days in that passage maybe wouldn't mean anything more than just a period of time, except 40 in the Bible, the additional meaning. Let's take a look on our little chart here and use the chart. It stands for a trial or a probation or a testing period. And so that's exactly what the purpose of Moses being gone for 40 days was. It was to test the faithfulness of the Jewish people that didn't know what happened to Moses. Now, they had just come through the Red Sea in this super unbelievable miracle of the Exodus, and yet they couldn't deal with the fact that Moses was gone for 40 days, and so they failed the test, in other words. So that's an example how these numbers are used. 3 is divine completion, perfection. It has here in the renditions I've seen in this table, 3 represents the divine Trinity, so Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or the unholy Trinity of Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. And so again, depending on how the number is used, there could be some additional information. 4 tends to point to things of this world or the creation. 5 tends to point to God's grace. So you get how numbers, when they're being used, could have some additional meaning or confirmation of the meaning of the text. Jesus, when he, right after he was baptized in the Jordan by John, went out into the wilderness for 40-day fast. Well, what's the point? He was tempted by Satan, so that was his trial or his testing period, right? So that's how these numbers add additional meaning to passages. So this is a chart. I can't claim good or bad in terms of the source I used. I was just looking for something that was more or less complete so that you had a starting point. Okay. Next concept is called near-far prophecy. This is used a lot in Isaiah, for instance. But the notion is this, is a prophecy can start out, say it's a judgment, it can start out with a description of the judgment unfolding, and then all of a sudden, somewhere in the passage, there's a bit of a transition, and then the prophecy comes to completion. And a lot of times it's hard to determine, did this prophecy, people talk about it got fulfilled in part in blah 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 year, but it was finally fulfilled in, and then another year is given. And this is the notion of near and far prophecy. It's the same prophetic passage, but it's pointing to 2 periods of time. Now, why would this be in the Bible? Well, in the Bible itself, it says, how would you know a real prophet from a false one? It's whether what he said came true. And so, in part, being a prophet of God was determined whether what he said was true. Then there better be some near fulfillments of some of that prophet's prophecies, or he would appear to be a false prophet. And so let's take a look at an example. Let's see if I have a good example. So before I flip the page, the rest of this description, I didn't go through this description on this screen, but it spoke of Isaiah, and Isaiah's being given a prophecy about the coming judgment on Jerusalem, Judah and Jerusalem, and he's talking about how Babylon is going to come and execute this judgment, but Babylon is also used in the end times, executing and bringing judgment in on the Jewish people during the last tribulation period. That's why it's called the time of Jacob's trouble. And so let me flip and see if I got the two passages here. Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 4 and 5, is the beginning of this judgment we're describing in Isaiah. Sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged. Why will you still be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick and the whole heart is faint. And so that's basically how in Isaiah 1 the prophecy starts. And then it carries all the way through describing how this judgment's going to happen and all that in Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 3. And then right toward the top of Isaiah 4, in verse 2, we get this strange little transition point. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by the spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. Okay, so this was the same prophecy, and we get to the top of Isaiah 4, and there's that catchphrase. And if you've watched some of the prior videos, I talk about if the day of the Lord is mentioned, or in that day is typically an indicator, or that dreadful day, it's usually talking about the final 7-year period. And we know by this description down here that Zion is being restored, and their filth will be washed away and all that. And so it's the consummation of the judgments that were first described here that occurred in the mid-500s BC to Israel is going to occur again in the tribulation period, with all the judgments and wrath being poured out. But as we know, when Jesus comes in his second coming, the remnant of the Jewish believers will be restored, just as it's mentioning here. So we get this near fulfillment that happened. Now, Isaiah wrote in the 700s BC. The near fulfillment was in the mid 5 to 600 BC time frame, and the far fulfillment is, 2600 years later here potentially. So there's huge gaps in here, and yet the passage, the only idea that there was a transition is, I should have included verse 1, but in verse 2 it goes, in that day, and then that's our transition point, and there was 2,500 years in between. So near far prophecy, again, it's sometimes
you just careful study and you see these transitions, you go, oh, I get it. Something happened there. So watch for those. Um, there's also in near far prophecy, people talk about the church age skip. They talk about the fact that, and we saw a little bit of that in the prior passage there, but there's a whole bunch of very specific ones where the church age is just skipped right on by within a verse. And so, again, if you understand that this can happen and you understand keywords like day of the Lord or in that day, a lot of times you can see these skips. I've heard there was either 12 or 24 of these in the Old Testament because there was no such thing as the church age in the Old Testament. But in those passages, a lot of times you can catch the fact that the prophet went from the near fulfillment to the far fulfillment, and what was in the middle was the missing church age. So that's all part of this near-far concept of prophecy. Okay, our last little topic, and then we're done with our fundamentals course here, is the meaning of names. And you'll see all throughout the Bible, even in the New Testament, in Revelation, for instance, in Revelation 1, Jesus claims a whole bunch of names for himself. And so a name in the Bible was supposed to somehow significantly relate to the person that received the name. And it's supposed to say something about the nature of the character of the person. And there's a famous little study that was done by Dr. Chuck Missler that I've included here. And he's got a website, khouse.org. I'm sorry, there's a little overlap there. But he noted in Genesis 5 that the order of the names in Genesis 5, if you just ticked off the people and in the order that the names are referenced, you get Adam and Seth and Enosh and Kenan and Mahalalel and Jared and Enoch and Methuselah and Lamech and Noah. And if you took the meaning of those names, you get man appointed, mortal, sorrow, the blessed God shall come down, teaching, his death shall bring, the despairing, rest or comfort. And so you can see here's the combined things. So scripted right into Genesis 5 is the redemption story that includes Jesus in his second coming, and Jesus in his first coming, dying for the sins of the people, and then restoring rest and comfort here at his second coming. So if there's any debate about whether God's in complete control in the authorship of the Bible, he uses these subtle things in the Bible, and he scripted the salvation story right into Genesis 5, which is just plain amazing. Now you can go out on the internet and Google different names in the Bible, and you'll see that there's actually cross-references and dictionaries that give you the definition of these names. And so this is just pointing you to the fact that exists, and sometimes that helps in understanding a passage. Okay, let's wrap it up then. Final kind of musings on this understanding prophecy core concepts is, and these really didn't fit anywhere, so I tacked a couple of these right on the end. If you're getting lists in the Bible, and give you an example, the Battle of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the first country that's referenced there, or the first group that's referenced there, we see Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and that usually is defined as Russia, and that's considered the first one in the battle. And then the second one and the rest of the list is separated a little bit. The second one was Persia, and then there's other countries right in a row listed. Well, usually the first in a list is important. So in the case of that Ezekiel 38 and 39 passage, Russia is the one that apparently drives an alliance, forms the alliance, and probably equips the alliance. And then the rest of the list is Persia with some followers. And so if we're applying this concept we're talking about here, The first element, Russia, is significant because it's leading the list and it's leading the group in the passage. So that's important. But actually, the way it's worded, it's Russia is identified, but then there's some description and then the rest of the list. And the first one on the rest of the list is Persia, and that's modern day Iran. And so Iran, with the rest of the coalition, is listed. Iran probably has some prominence then in the coalition that's formed, that's as it's described in that passage. So first element in the list is significant. First mention of a concept in the Bible is significant as well. And so if you have a concept like love or wrath or whatever, go to a concordance and find the first usage of the word. And that a lot of times will give you the best definition of how the word is being used in the Bible. And that's just kind of a rule of thumb. Hang on to that one. And the last thing I would say, if you're doing a Bible study, not just reading the Bible, personally would recommend comparing 2 or 3 different commentaries on a passage. So if you're reading Daniel, go get 2 or 3 commentaries on Daniel. And especially in prophetic passages, I'll give you some more hints. If you're dealing with end times prophecy, the more current the commentary is, probably the better the commentary is, because we know the Bible is progressive revelation, and in Daniel we heard Daniel be told that shut up the book until the end, and then these things would be unveiled. Well, if you take a commentary from the 17 or 1800s or whatever, or one of the fathers of the church, and you're studying Daniel, for instance, the Bible said that the prophecy is shut up until the end, so you're shooting yourself in the foot. So prophetic study, especially end time study, the more current the commentary, the better. There are some quote fathers of modern day biblical prophecy, and I would highly recommend making sure that 1 or 2 of their studies is in there. So I would recommend Chuck Missler, Chuck Smith, for instance. I like Jack Kelly, Dr. John Walvoord, although he's passed. He was definitely in the father of these studies, very, very much an academic in his analysis. So there's a handful of them, but you can find others. Just make sure that they're comprehensive and they're current. And if you're looking at Old Testament passages, make one pass through the Septuagint. We have a whole series, the Tinfoil Hat series, where I'm using the Septuagint quite a lot. You'll pick up things in the Septuagint that aren't in the other Old Testament versions, which are based on what's called the Masoretic text. And I'm not going to get into that now. It's just the Septuagint might give you a slightly different twist on some of the passages. It's worth throwing that in as a read-through if you're doing a Bible study. So that's it on prophecy. Thanks, guys, for hanging in on this kind of a fundamentals teaching course. But you get this nailed, then the prophetic passages are much easier to get through.